All right, heroes, welcome to the Rabbi John Carrier YouTube channel. This is a live studio recording of the Jew Curious Show podcast. And today, our topic is the Hebrew Bible. And in the thumbnail, it says the Hebrew Bible versus the Old Testament. I didn't mean it to sound so adversarial, like some sort of grudge match between these two books. What I wanted to highlight is the difference between what the Bible of the Jewish people is versus what other peoples call the Old Testament, because sometimes people think that's the same thing, or they say, "Oh, you worship from the Old Testament, we worship from the New Testament," and that's not entirely accurate. So, but before we get into that, I'm going to go over what is kind of a very broad overview. It's a big book. We're not gonna like explain the whole book, or I'm not just gonna sit here and read it out loud. That would be a very long video. But we're going to talk about what the contents of the Hebrew Bible are, also known as the Tanakh, and what Tanakh means. It's actually not a word; it's an acronym, like CIA or FBI or BTW or LOL. A little holier than you say LOL, but we're going to talk about what the Tanakh is, what is in the Tanakh, and how it's different from how, let's say, Christian traditions think of as the Old Testament. It's not a one-for-one comparison, both in content and also in interpretation. But before we get into that, I just want to say hi to everybody who is joining me. Let's see if anybody's joined me. It's so much fun to learn live. I see Jason is already here. Jason, I believe, is in Ireland and is just sticking challah in the oven. That's awesome. Let's see. I'm going to just give a shout out to everybody. Hi. Where y'all? Because I say y'all. That's my yichus. Y'all from... We got Kathy in the house. Got a lot of good Jew Curious friends watching right now. And so throughout this discussion, feel free to give me a shout out. Just say hi. Tell me, if your YouTube name is different from your regular name. If you want to tell me your regular name, I'll totally give you a shout out on the Jew Curious Show podcast. Whatever questions you have about this topic, please put them in the chat. I've got some things that I want to share with you, but I also really love the Q&A portions of these YouTube live sessions. And it's not like just one big thing that I save for the end. I'll break from time to time, jump into the chat, answer people's questions, because it is really my great hope that this is not just a lecture, but this is a discussion, that this is a conversation. I've got a lot of data and lecture-y stuff to share with you, just to make sure you know what I know, but I love to break from time to time, answer questions live, and make this an interactive experience for as many people as possible. If you are watching this video later, you're not in here live, but you're seeing the recording later, feel free to ask whatever questions you want or make what comments you want in the comment section of this video if you're watching it by video. If you are listening to it on the Jew Curious Show podcast, go to the Jew Curious Show Facebook page and throw your questions in there, throw your comments in there. If you don't like my teaching style, let me know. If you do like my teaching style, that's nice to hear. You're a very nice person. So just love to make this as interactive as possible. Want to make sure you get your questions answered, because that's my gig, that's my job. I'm a rabbi, that's what I do. So hello to Val from Florida. Hi to Kathy from the beach in California. So that's one of the great benefits of living in California. Although it did snow yesterday in Southern California. It snowed in Calabasas, it snowed in Pasadena, and people weren't expecting that. Doesn't happen that often. So in any case, then we're talking about the weather. That's boring stuff. I could be talking, the 405 is terrible. If you're not from California, if you're not from Southern California, we don't really talk about the weather because the weather almost never really changes. What we talk about instead is traffic, because traffic for us, a little froggy in there, traffic for us is akin to weather. So sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, mostly bad. So I'll say the traffic in California is like the weather in I don't know, Minnesota or the Shetland Islands or something like that. So no offense. Hi, Minnesota. Hi, Shetland Islands, if anybody's watching from there. So let's get into the topic today. I'm just going to pull up my notes. I don't have the whole Torah memorized yet. I'm still kind of a brand new rabbi. Not brand new. I've been doing this for about 4.5 years now. But there's a lot to talk about, so I'm just going to pull up some notes here. And the first thing I want to talk about is the Tanakh. Now, I made another video on this channel. It's about 90 seconds long that gives you a quick overview of the Tanakh. We're going to unpack that a little bit today. When we say Hebrew Bible, that's sort of an English way of saying what is the canonized scripture for the Jewish people. You know, some dudes got together a couple thousand years ago, a little less, and said, okay, we have a bunch of books that we consider sacred, you know, either revealed to Moses by God or revealed by God through prophets, or just recorded history of human encounters with the divine or human encounters within this holy community. And we're going to decide which of it is going to be sort of fixed in what we call our Bible or our scripture, the sort of highest level of holy text, and which is, you know, nice but not necessarily belonging in that category. And so definitely the first thing that belongs in that category is the Torah. And the Torah has sort of many layers of interpretation in terms of, okay, is the Torah the first five, what are called the 5 books of Moses? Is the Torah the entirety of the scripture? Does the Torah include all of the glosses and commentary and interpretations? Does the Torah include oral traditions of interpretation of those first 5 books of Moses and beyond? And the answer is yes. When we say we are studying Torah, that could mean we are studying the 5 books of Moses. We are studying the entirety of the canonized scripture. That could mean we are studying the commentary and interpretations through things like the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrash and the law codes. This is not for nothing we're called the people of the book, right? Because it should be books, plural. But the very core, the kernel of it, is what our tradition says was revealed to Moses by God, and Moses sort of took dictation and then handed that down from generation to generation. And these are 5 books. Lost count today. There are 5 books, and their sort of common English names are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In Hebrew, that's Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Dvarim. And those aren't like one-for-one translations. Actually, in Hebrew, those words mean different things. They're usually the first distinctive word of the book, and then that's how we name our books. So I guess if, you know, it was Charles Dickens wrote, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. In Hebrew, that book might have been called Zmanim, like times, who knows, instead of whatever that book, I think it was Tale of Two Cities. But, you know, English scholars don't beat me up. I spent more time in total on Hebrew literature than English literature. So we have these 5 books that also form the core, or the first 5 books of, you know, what's considered the Christian Bible. But these are ours, right? These started with the creation of the world, the formation of a covenant with the sort of first family of Judaism with Abraham and Sarah, and then that covenant was reiterated with Isaac and Jacob, and then so it goes from a covenant with a person to a covenant with a family, and then after that family goes into Egypt, multiplies a great deal, but then is oppressed by slavery and captivity and harsh labor and attempts at genocide. And then God remembers the covenant with this people and calls out to Moses and gives him a job offer and says, I need you to be sort of my representative on the earthly plane to help liberate these people because of this covenant that I remember. And so Moses does. They go out in the desert and they get to Mount Sinai or Har Sinai, and God says, okay, look, you are a free people. You can do anything you want, but you may wonder, what should you do? And so God gave us, you know, first the 10 Commandments, verbally. Everybody there could hear it. And then the people were like, oh, that's kind of loud. We're a little bit scared. How about Moses, you go take the rest of it and bring it back to us? And Moses did. Moses went up, brought the rest of it down. And this became not a new covenant, but a sort of a next level iteration or upgrade of the original covenant. So we went from a covenant with a person, Abraham, to a covenant with a family, Abraham's family, and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Rebekah and Rachel and Leah and everybody else, to a covenant with a people, right? And so as all the people who are present at Mount Sinai, there are some, I'll say, metaphysical teachings that all the souls of, not only were all the Jews who were alive then there to hear it, but also all the souls of any Jew who had ever lived and who would ever be born, including anyone who would ever convert to Judaism. So it's not just the genetic family; it's the adopted kids like me as well. And so we received this revelation, and what we received was these 5 books. And so that forms the core of the Torah, and we just sort of call that part the Torah. But there are additional works as well, and I'll go back to the word Tanakh. And Tanakh is an acronym of, excuse me, my voice is a little bad this morning, of Torah, I'm so sorry, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. And that's a taf and a nun and a chaf in Hebrew letters. And those stand for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Only in the when you have a chaf when you have a kaf at the end of a word, it becomes a chaf. So it's not Tanakh, it's Tanakh. And so that's an acronym for these 3 sets of texts. The first one being the Torah, and then the next one is called Nevi'im, which means prophets. And so this contains a whole big bucket of books that includes, we kind of divide it between the Nevi'im Rishonim, the former prophets, or prophets 1, and the Nevi'im acronym, or the latter prophets, or prophets 2, if you will. Prophets 2, prophetic boogaloo, if anybody was a child of the 80s like I was. So these Nevi'im Rishonim include Yehoshua or Joshua, includes Shoftim or Judges, and then it includes works like Shmuel and Melachim or Samuel and Kings. And so in most editions of Bibles, each of these is split. There's like 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, or Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet. And same with King. There's Melachim Aleph, Melachim Bet, and it's 1 Kings and 2 Kings. And these are more, let's say, historical works than the prophets that come after them. So in the book of Joshua, it's sort of the story of our crossing the Jordan into the promised land and integrating with that area of the world. We had to conquer some cities. Some people weren't so happy to see us, but that's the land that we came back to based on a promise between God and our ancestors. And it's about filling that land and parceling it up among the tribes and saying, okay, we have fulfilled this promise that God made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Rebekah and Rachel and Leah. And that's the book of Joshua. And so from there, it goes into the book of Judges. Now, at this point, even though we have sovereignty and self-governance in this land, we don't have a leader like Moses necessarily. We don't have a king because we just consider that God is our king. Unlike other peoples who have human kings, we have God as a king. But we do have decision makers, let's say, and these are shoftim or judges. And so there are various judges like Gidon and Devorah and other judges. And we go from the history of entering the land to this period of self-governance and how that goes. And it's not always, let's say, pretty. It's there are some attacks from without. There is some infighting between the tribes that goes on that gets pretty severe, and that's the book of Judges. And then from there, we get into the books of Samuel, where Samuel is a prophet, or Shmuel, and where we left it at the end of the book of Judges is that we've got so much infighting that it's hard to defend ourselves from external enemies, and the people cry out and they say, this whole thing would go away if we just had a king. Why can't we be like any other nation and have a king? And the prophet Samuel said, that is a terrible idea, right? If you have a king, you know what kings do? Kings start wars. They, bring in a whole bunch of different wives to make peace treaties with their fathers or mothers. And so, kings take many wives from foreign lands in order to make peace in all these wars that they started themselves. And to fund these wars, they tax people mercilessly, and they conscript soldiers, and they levy labor and all this stuff. That's what kings do. Are you sure you want that? And the people are like, yep, we just want to be a nation like anybody else. And Shmuel talks to God, and God says, okay, you want a king, have a king. And so they pick Shaul, or Saul, to be the first king over Bnei Israel, over the Hebrew people in that part of the world. And, it goes well. Sometimes it goes badly. Shmuel's kind of a hothead. Some people look at him and sort of retroactively diagnose him with bipolar disorder. He's kind of a moody dude. And then another king comes along, and this is David. And I don't want to fast forward, I don't want to spoil it, but we have a callback here in a second. So David becomes king. David unifies the kingdom against different attackers, both foreign and domestic, and has a pretty good run. I mean, he has kind of a rocky life, very complicated family story. His first wife kind of insults him and disavows him, and he's like, all right, well, then I guess we're not going to have any kids. And then later on, he meets this wonderful lady named Bathsheba, who happens to be married to somebody else. And David takes that somebody else and sends him to war, knowing that he'll be killed, so that he could have the widow Bathsheba. And so there's kind of a little bit of a scandalous romance, however, but good things, some good things come of it. Because their son is Shlomo, or Solomon. And throughout David's life, David's devoted to the service of God, and he begs God. He's the one who is responsible for bringing the Arona Kodesh, or the Ark of the Covenant, into Jerusalem. And he wants to build a temple, and God says, I'm sorry. I mean, yes, you have fought for me this whole time. You have unified the people. You have brought holiness into Jerusalem. But I can't let you be the one to build the temple. You are a man of war. You literally have blood on your hands. And while I appreciate your service, I don't want the temple itself to be connected to that violent history. Your son can build it, but you can't. And so his son Shlomo, or Solomon, becomes the next king. And Solomon is famous for being, the wisest person who ever lived, because Solomon also had a relationship with God. And God said, I want you to be a successful king. What is it that you desire that'll help you be successful? And Solomon thinks about it. He's like, look, I could ask for power. I could ask for, luck and victory and military success. I could ask for wealth. But I think I'm going to ask instead for wisdom, because that's going to best serve me and best serve my people. And so God says, good choice. Since you asked for wisdom instead of all those other things, I will give you wisdom, and you'll get power, success, and wealth, right? Because with wisdom, all of those other things can be acquired. And so Solomon rules with wisdom, and Solomon, because he is not this man of war that his father was necessarily, merited to build the first temple. So we go from a portable sanctuary of worship to a permanent house of worship. The trouble is, in order to build this temple and in order to maintain this kingdom, Solomon's got to fight some battles here and there, to take land that has resources in them. He's got to marry wives from various kingdoms in order to consolidate peace with those lands. He's got to conscript labor to go cut down trees and hew stones and build all sorts of great stuff. And he's got to tax people for this. And if you have heard this story before, this is exactly what Solomon said would happen if the people had a king. It just took 3 generations to do it. And so this is kind of the contents of the books of Samuel, and we get into Kings. And then Kings, after Solomon, things kind of go downhill. Like, we never had another good king as wise as Solomon. So there are various kings of the Hebrew people. There's direct succession, there's some infighting, there's some palace intrigue and things like that go on. And within the books of Kings, we get great kings like Ahav or Ahab. They say that ironically, not such a great king, very heavily influenced by his wife Jezebel, and she was sort of like the original Lady Macbeth, who was sort of pushed him into action, had heavy influence, was very powerful in her own right. And also within the Book of Kings, we get some prophets, and probably the most famous prophet from the Book of Kings is Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. And so by the time we get to Ahab, Yirat Shamayim, the fear of heaven, the awe of God had kind of disintegrated among the kings of our people. And so there are all sorts of prophets for other gods who had taken their place and taken their place in the priesthood and the holy worship. Jezebel was a big fan of the prophets of Baal, for example. And then this, kind of scruffy looking weirdo comes out of the wilderness in like a big, fur coat and says, calls BS on the whole thing. Just calls like, nope, this is not what we're about, right? And he is a prophet of our God. And one of my favorite scenes in the books of Kings is sort of the prophet bake-off, or like so you think you got prophecy. I don't know what this is, but it's basically they set this thing up where Elijah says, tell you what, we'll get all your prophets together, all of your priests together, and me, and we will all build altars, and we will all make sacrifices on those altars, and then we will burn those sacrifices, as this is the custom of temple worship. And we'll see which sacrifices are accepted. And so the prophets Baal and Elijah all get together. They're sacrificing animals. They're putting the sacrificial meat and stuff on the altars. And all the prophets of Baal are like trying to light the fires, and they don't light. And it's very embarrassing for them, frankly. Meanwhile, Elijah, just to kind of egg them on, like takes water and dumps it on his firewood and dumps it on the things, like just douses the whole thing in water so it's never going to catch. And he's like watching these guys can't light their fire. He's dumping water on his firewood, and suddenly flame comes out of heaven and consumes the sacrifice of Eliyahu. And he punks all of them. And then he proceeds to stab all of them in sort of a fit of religious zeal. And that earns him a death warrant. And he has to run into the wilderness, where he has an encounter with God. And God says, look, I'm with you. And this is one of my other favorite scenes, where Elijah wants to witness the presence of God, and God says, okay, go to the mouth of the cave and see and look out. And there are all these cataclysmic events. There's a fire, there's a great wind, there's an earthquake, and Elijah keeps observing that there's didn't see God in any of these cataclysms, but instead here's this still small voice that speaks to him. And so sometimes we see God in natural wonder, sometimes we see God in great dramatic events, but this reminds us that sometimes we can hear God's presence in this just still small voice speaking to us personally. His successor was a guy named Elisha, who was another prophet prominent in the books of Kings. And then from there, we have the Nevi'im acronym, the latter prophets. And each of these books is named after, before we had things like Joshua and then Judges, and Joshua was named after Joshua. Judges was kind of a generic title. Shmuel was named after Shmuel, but then we have Kings, and then we go back to stuff named after people, and that's the Nevi'im acronym, the latter prophets, and that's where we get things like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Hosea and Joel and Amos and Obadiah and Yonah and Micha and Nahum and Habakkuk and Zephaniah and Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi. And, after, let's say, after Ezekiel, sort of all those guys are bundled into what is in the Tanakh kind of one book divided into 12 sections, and these are sort of, or just excuse me, is it 12 or is it 13? No, it's the 12. It's the Treyasar, but the Treyasar, that's Aramaic. It sounds like Trey, like three, but Trey in Aramaic is 2, so Treyasar is 12. So these are the 12 latter prophets of people like Hosea and Joel and Amos and Obadiah, or Obadiah, if you will. And so these are each people who were prophets. And what does a prophet mean? In sort of modern English language, it's like people who see the future, right? It's like fortune telling or divining or something like that. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel points out that if you take a look at what these guys are doing, they're less fortune tellers than they are social critics or social advocates. Because what they did was they looked out at how things were going. And, in the beginning of Isaiah's time, things were going, pretty good by some measures. He had a kingdom, it was prosperous. But he looks out and he sees, like, look, this isn't exactly according to our principles, right? Like, yes, people are doing all the religious things that they're supposed to do. They're sacrificing the right number of bulls on the right holidays, and they're doing the mitzvahs, but they're ignoring the poor, right? That they're not really being faithful to God. They're more about the religion than the faith, and the rituals of the religion had become for them kind of like a golden cow, if you will. They were worshiping the religion, not the God that inspired that religion that's supposed to support faith. And so he looks at this and he's like, this is not going to end well. It's like if we are going to get so far from God, we're not going to get in this, get to stay in this land much longer. And this wasn't fortune telling. This was logic. This was mixed with a little bit of faith. And so it looks like he's a seer, but he's really a critic, right? And then in later parts, he says, okay, now we're in exile. This stinks. Kind of told you so, right? And Jeremiah, too, was kind of a depressing dude, talked a lot about destruction and very kind of sad book. But there are also points in Jeremiah where he says, like, look, I know it's bad now, but as long as we cling to God, things will get better. Has this vision while he's sitting in prison. He has this connection with God that tells him to essentially buy property in Jerusalem, a place that, he was exiled from. And he's like, why? We're never going to get back there. But God's like, trust me, things are going to get better. And it's very, very economic example. And so, and Ezekiel was a more, I'll say, visionary prophet in the sense of he's not looking at the social situation and saying, okay, here's my assessment of it. He's granted these fantastical visions that then we have been interpreting ever since. Sees a fiery chariot driven by an angel with 6 wings and 4 faces, and we're still trying to figure that one out. He sees a valley of dry bones reassemble themselves into people and then get up and sing to God. And he has he has visions of the restoration of he has vision of a prophet. Or not, excuse me, not a prophet, but a priest of the Tzadokite line, being dressed in rags, then having those rags and being like on trial with Hasatan, interrogating him and shaming him, and then his clothes are replaced by clean clothes, and he's restored to his office. And this is a vision of the restoration of the holy service and our people to the land. And so this is kind of what the prophets were into. They were about giving criticism when we needed criticism. They were about giving hope when we needed hope. And in a traditional read, they weren't really necessarily speaking for themselves or speaking by themselves, but they were channeling God. This was a new kind of revelation. We had private revelation of God talking to Abraham and Moses and people like that. We had a public revelation of the 10 Commandments. And this is a new, it's almost like a vicarious revelation where God is speaking through these people. And that's the Nevi'im. And let's see, I'm going to take a pause before I get into the Ketuvim because there's a bunch more books to go. Just hold on for the ride. But I want to take a look at who is in the chat right now. We have people from Florida. We have somebody, Teresa's giving us a shalom and good Shabbos. I'm with you on that one. So it is, it's about 9:30 in the morning here in California. Still got a few hours left to prepare for Shabbos. We got hello from Miami. We got Shampoo Max. That's a new one. I haven't seen you before. We have Shabbat Shalom from South Africa. We have, let's see what else we have. Jason asks, do you agree some is parables and some is historical? So yes, I do agree with that. And it gets into the word, like, what exactly does historical mean? Is the question, is some of this historical in the sense that it really happened in the time and place and way in which it was said to happen in a verifiable sense? And so where most of these things came from, we have this tradition of Moses getting the Torah verbatim from God. People have different opinions, or people have different beliefs about that. Most of what is in the Tanakh is thought to have come not from people sitting there writing down things that were happening, but an oral tradition, albeit a pretty stable one. Like, people had these stories of these things happening, and it's very similar, if not identical, versions of these stories for generations. And at one point they were written down and then assembled together. And some would say even the narrative from the first 5 books were oral traditions before they were written traditions. And you say, well, oral traditions, that's like a game of telephone. You can't, do that. I had this, one of my teachers, Rabbi Aryeh Cohen, kind of blew my mind when he talked about oral publications, meaning these stories came into like a stable and repeatable form and were handed down with great fidelity. And an outside example of that would be the Iliad from Homer, or the Odyssey, where it's thought that the Iliad and the Odyssey were poems transmitted orally long before they were ever written down. Right? They were for maybe hundreds of, and these were stories that Homer probably heard from before, and he's just sort of most famous for spreading these tales. And so it's possible to have an oral tradition that is very stable and repeatable before you have writing, and that's what Rabbi Cohen meant by oral publication. And so, can we say they are historical? We don't have necessarily witnesses to anything until we get into the times of kings, where the actions of kings and what happened in battle and things like that were reflected in the written traditions or oral traditions of other peoples around us. And that's sort of that's like a witness to what was going on. So my faith is that this is the story of our family, right? And you've got family stories. So I guess, most people out here, didn't like hatch out of an egg or a test tube or something. Everybody's got a family, and every family has stories. And some of those stories get embellished or changed over time. But within those embellishments, within some versions of different perspectives, there are these kernels of truth as to what happened. And so if you're asking me if I think they are factual or metaphorical, I think they can be true even when they're metaphorical in the sense. So that's different rabbis have different opinions about this. Different branches of Judaism say, yes, the whole thing came from God, and not one letter has changed since the very beginning. There are other people who say, no, this was all human beings who were divinely inspired. And some people say these are just human beings writing a story that would help maintain law and order. And so there are many different versions of this, beliefs about this within the Jewish family. And so what I do is I study Torah and Tanakh and commentaries, trying to derive the truth of human existence, what is profitable, beneficial, what is good for us, And that gets to a kind of truth that does seem to me to come from God and the relationship between God and people, and all people and the Jewish people in particular. And so, you can look at things like the flood. The flood of Noah is there's a similar story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example. The story of the Tower of Babel. Do we have the ruins? Do we have the blueprints? No, but it sounds kind of like a fable because it explains human diversity. From within, less than 20 generations of human history, we went from one couple to a diverse human population that people could see. Like everybody, there's a bunch of different nations out there, and they all speak these different languages. So how did that happen? So they said, well, let me tell you a story about a tower. And God decided, that tower was getting too tall, so I'm just going to make everybody speak 70 different languages. And 70 in Hebrew is kind of not a metaphor or a code word or something. It just means a lot, right? The word 70 means, it's like, what's a big number? 70 is a big number. That's as long as, most people live. So that's a big number. So some of these things sound like fables. Some of these are sort of etiologies or origin stories. Like we needed to know, where does human sexuality come from? And so we have a narrative of Adam and Eve. Where does jealousy and murder come from? Another human factor. We have a story of Cain and Abel, which includes both jealousy or envy and murder. And so you can read these as metaphor or parables or fables. You could read these as history if you like. And either way, those two people can get together and say, okay, what's the proper way to act in the world? What are some human experiences of divine encounters? And so people with very different opinions about where these come from or their facticity or whatever, their scientific verifiable accuracy, they can disagree about that, but we can get together and see this as our family story, whether it was actually as it happened or not. So I'm going to jump into this and see some more. It's a really great question, Jason. I appreciate you bringing that up. What is the proper Hebrew pronunciation of the name Elijah? Thank you for asking. So this is just my habit. I kind of flip back and forth between the English transliterations and the Hebrew. The contemporary Hebrew pronunciation of Elijah is Eliyahu, or so Eliyahu Hanavi, and then the prophets. I think I named most of them in their English names, but Isaiah is Yeshayahu. Jeremiah is Yirmiyahu, Ezekiel is Yehezkel, and so we have a few things like that. What's really interesting, there's a lot of J names in the Bible. There's a lot of J sounds like Elijah. There's Jacob and Joseph and Joshua. There is no J sound in the Hebrew language. And where these come from, and I'm sorry, I'm going to wax out on like my linguistics nerd kind of hobby, is that when German translators of Hebrew, when the Germans were translating the Bible into the vernacular, thanks Martin Luther, were taking Hebrew texts and translating them, and they looked at things like Yaakov and Yosef and Yehoshua. There's not really a J sound, I don't think, in the German language either, but the letter J that we use from the Roman alphabet makes a Y sound in German, and it was mostly Germans doing this translation work. So Yaakov became Jacob, and Yosef became Joseph, and so we have all these things like these J names, even though there was no J in Hebrew phonemes, if you will. So that was more than you asked. So sorry about that. Say hi to Susan from Flagler Beach, Florida, and Jason's back in here. Let's see. Exodus has been researched, and actually most of what is said happened. How it happened is proved, but still a miracle recently. There are lots of different stories about this. Rabbi David Wolpe there's a famous sermon out there where he asks the question, did the Exodus happen as it's written down in the book? And there are other people who've gone the other way and say, oh, I can scientifically prove how frogs can invade a place, how the river can appear to turn into blood, and then I've seen with computer graphic mock-ups and things like that, how a sea might split in certain weather and seismic conditions. So there are some people who take great pains to prove the historicity of this, and there are other people who say, well, maybe it didn't exactly happen like that, but isn't this a powerful story of redemption? A powerful story of, as I was learning last night with some of my students from the Miller Introduction to Judaism course, Rabbi Adam Greenwald teaches that this is the story of Exodus, of God intervening with the situation with Pharaoh and Egypt and all that, was sort of the first recorded human narrative of God siding with justice instead of power. And from that, we derive values that end in the rule of law. And so, whether there were 10 plagues, however Pharaoh reacted to that, whether the sea split, this is a profound shift in human thinking. Whether might makes right, or justice and the rule of law should prevail. And to me, that's a miracle. Right? We could have gone the entirety of human history thinking, okay, might makes right. If you're rich, if you're powerful, you get whatever you want. That's it. Or we could say there is a higher authority and higher principles at work. And I think that's the greatest miracle of the Exodus right there. I'm also grateful for not being a slave. So let's see what else we have in there. We have Exodus, we have Jason, we have Kathy, we have Susan, Fair Cogent. Let's see. So many people chiming in today. Really appreciate people learning this with me right as we're getting ready for Shabbat. People in all sorts of time zones, countries, continents. I think I'm counting 3 continents right now in this live. I'm blown away by this. This is why I love teaching on YouTube. I love teaching in synagogues. I love teaching in classrooms here in Los Angeles. And I love teaching on the internet because we're getting all sorts of people from all different backgrounds and all sorts of perspectives. But I want to keep my promise and get into the Ketuvim, or the writings. And I'm going to go through that kind of quickly just because I want to make time to talk about the distinctions between the, let's say, the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. So in Ketuvim, we have poetic books. We have sort of these occasional scrolls, if you will, or megillot. And we have some, what we'll call other books that are sort of supplementary histories. And in our poetic books, we have, our poetic books, we have Tehillim and Mishlei and Eov. And Tehillim is the Psalms. Right? These are largely attributed to David. David was, in addition to a king and an able warrior and kind of a ladies' man, he was also a poet and a musician. Our tradition is that he, played lyre. The lyre is like a stringed harp kind of instrument. And he composed poems about his adoration for God, about how he perceived his kingdom. And these are the Psalms, about 150 of them, let's say. And so, and after the Psalms, so this was David's kind of legacy to us. And it's important because so much of Jewish liturgy, so much of the prayers that we say in holy services come from the Psalms. The prayer book is almost an anthology of Psalms, and with some blessings bracketing things. After that, we have the legacy of his offspring Shlomo, or Solomon, and that is Mishlei, or Proverbs, is traditionally ascribed to Solomon. And there's lots of wise sayings in there about how to govern a kingdom, how to govern a household, how to manage your wealth. I listened to a podcast about business, and they often, and it's a podcast that's sort of run by some Christians. Going to give a big shout out to Shane and Jocelyn Sams, who taught me so much about how to teach online in a sustainable way. So really appreciate them. And they end their podcast with a Bible verse, and sometimes it's Christian text, but sometimes it's, let's say, a text that belongs in the Hebrew Bible, and so many times it's Proverbs. It's like the right way to live your life and the right way to manage your affairs. And it's also got Eshet Chayil in there. It's like the sort of praiseworthy woman of valor. And so a lot of wise sayings that we have nowadays that come from the Bible come from the book of Proverbs. So if Tehillim are poems, Proverbs is more like, guide to life, aphorisms. And then we have Eov. We have the story of Job. And the story of Job is about a man's faith being tested, about friends looking at it from the outside and saying, "Hey, maybe you're not as good as you think you are if you're getting all these terrible judgments on you." And at the end, God comes in and says, "Look, my ways are not your ways. My reasoning is not your reasoning. If things seem uncomfortable in the world, if righteous people seem to be suffering and wicked people seem to be prospering, which is eternal within the human condition, and the hardest question I think any religion has to answer, this is God showing up and saying, like, look, you can't see all the threads in this. And you're going to have to trust me that sometimes, yes, apparently there is injustice in the world. And our humanity's job is to work toward greater justice. That's my read on it. And then we have the 5 Megillot, the 5 scrolls. We have one of them is Shir HaShirim, or the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, sometimes it's called. This was a bit of a hot topic when they were doing the whole canonization thing, and I believe the Council of Jamnia, or Yavna, if you will, is the Hebrew name of the place. And so they said, okay, this book, it's a book of, I'll say, very explicit love poetry, like people talking about each other's bodies in very romantic ways. And so people are like, I don't think this belongs in our holy scripture. This seems kind of like, what kids are reading when they should be reading the Torah. And I believe it was Rabbi Akiva says, no, this is a holy book. First off, Solomon wrote it. That was his thinking. So it belongs with the other writings of Solomon. Second off, don't get your mind out of the gutter. This isn't about two people who are in love. This is a love poem in metaphor about the relationship between God and the Jewish people. And so absolutely it belongs in the canon. So this is something that we read on Passover because there's a lot of springtime metaphors. There's like newborn, baby deer and lilies of the field and like springtime and revival of nature. And Passover is a spring holiday. Another one is Ruth. We read this during Shavuot. Ruth is the story of Ruth, where she is the sort of first. Or she's not the first convert. Abraham was the first convert, but she is sort of the matron saint, if you will, of converts because she was not part of the family, and in a time, but she married into it. But then her husband died, and her mother-in-law was like, "Look, you have no necessary allegiance. You can go. Like we're going to starve out here without these without our husbands. You should go back to your people." And she says, "No, don't make me go. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you stay, I will stay. Wherever you are buried, let me be buried. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God." And so she is, like I said, she's considered sort of an avatar of the conversion process into Judaism, where we say, "Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." She didn't have to join this. Right, it was very hard decision at that point because nothing was going well for that family, but she did, and she was the great grandmother of, I think there's 5 or 6 greats in there, of King David, and King David is the supposed ancestor of Mashiach, or the Messiah, and so the Messiah comes from this Moabite woman. The Moabites have sort of a bad story about where they came about, and her husband Boaz, and Boaz has kind of a scandalous story where he came from between Tamar and Yehuda. And so these imperfect people would give rise to David and the Mashiach. And so that's the story of Ruth. We read it on Shavuot. This is a holiday of revelation of the Torah. We also have Echa, or Lamentations. That's read on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is like the saddest day of the Jewish calendar, where we commemorate all sorts of terrible things that happened to us. And the rabbi said, you can't do anything fun on that day. You have to be sad the whole time. And, we think Torah study is fun, so no Torah study on that day. And some rabbis are like, really? No Torah study at all? Does that sound very Jewish to you? And they said, okay, you can read Echa. You can read Lamentations. You can read the saddest book, but that's it. And so on this sad day, we read the Megillat Echa, or the scroll or book of Lamentations. We also have Qohelet and Esther. Qohelet, is Ecclesiastes, and I think also attributed to Solomon. And it's sort of in counterposition to to Mishle, to Proverbs that has a lot of sort of positive, here's the right way to live, and in a well-ordered world. In Qohelet, it's a little bit more. It's a little bit more fatalistic. It's like, look, sometimes we die, sometimes we live. There's a time for being born. There's a time for dying. There's a time for planting. There's a time for reaping. There's a time for sadness and a time for happiness. Like, this is just life, y'all. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, so eat, drink, and be merry. And that's kind of the spirit of Qohelet. And we read that on Sukkot, because Sukkot is our harvest season, which is a time for eating and drinking and being merry, because we don't know what next year's harvest is going to be like. And then finally, we have kind of most famous Megillah, if you hear the word Megillah, and that is Esther. And this is the story of this is a story of Jews within the Persian Empire. We got not much time left and a lot to cover, so I'll kind of sum it up. There were Jews in the Persian Empire. There's a story about a guy, Haman, kind of a vizier of the king, who wanted to wipe us out because of his own kind of jealousy and issues with Jews, and convinced the king that this was a good idea. And Esther, who had not revealed herself as a Jewish person when the king married her, comes out and says, look, if you're going to kill the Jews, you got to take me out too. And sort of bravely reveals her identity. And for that, we are saved. And this is what we read on the holiday of Purim. And Purim is a holiday of great celebration and, let's say, acting up, if you will, or costumes, because there's people who are hidden and then revealed. And this entire scroll of Esther, God's name does not appear once. And so people ask, like, is God absent? They say, no, God is hidden. Just as Esther is hidden. And just as the story of her uncle Mordecai has some hidden and revealed aspects to it. So this is a story of not God's absence, but of God working through people along those common values. And so that's all of the scrolls that we have. We have additional books like Daniel and Ezra and Nehemiah and Divrei Hayamim, which is a fancy Hebrew way of saying Chronicles, the book of First and Second Chronicles, which are, it's kind of like the Deuteronomy of the Tanakh, where it goes through other historical events and repeats them or lays them out in a slightly different way. And so that's the Tanakh. That's the Hebrew Bible. This is what the rabbis, the Council of Yavneh said, this is what's in, and the other books are out. And this is not exactly the same as the Old Testament. And first I'll get into kind of the details of the books, what's in and what's out. And then I want to get to a more bigger philosophical issue of why we don't call our Bible the Old Testament. And that is to say, let's see, are there any questions here? Nope, we're pretty quiet in the chat, so that's okay. Feel free, if you have questions, keep chiming in. If you just have, I don't know, challah recipes or jokes to tell, feel free to do that in the chat. We have a lot of fun here. I don't want anybody to think that because I'm a little bit jokey, I don't take this seriously. As my friend Mike Wallstein would say, it's as serious as a heart attack. Right? This is what I have dedicated my life to, and I take all of it incredibly seriously. But I'm also kind of a jokey person by nature, and I teach that way because I think it makes it more memorable and makes things sink in. Sorry, I just kind of lifted the curtain there for a little bit. But I don't want anybody to think that I don't think this stuff is the highest value in my life. So what is considered the Hebrew Bible, all the books of the Tanakh, and what is the canonized scripture of some Christian groups, and I say different groups, is not the same. What's called the Old Testament is not the same as the Tanakh. Now, my understanding from research is that the Protestant denominations of Christianity decided that their Old Testament would be the same as the Tanakh. And so I haven't checked, but I'm pretty sure there's sort of a one-for-one. What we call the Hebrew Bible is what many or most Protestant denominations call the Old Testament. So they are the same books, but that does not make them the same, and I'll tell you why in a minute. However, the Catholic canon, the Roman Catholic canon, has additional books that it said, okay, they decided, okay, this is in. Like, this is Scripture. This is all in the same level as, Genesis and Mark and Matthew and those guys. And so these belong in the collection. And those are books like the first and second Maccabees, right? And books like Judith and Tobit, which were different stories. And then, but they set aside some other books. They also made some decisions that these guys are out, like third Maccabees, who needs it? And then additionally, within Orthodox Christian denominations, they said there are more books still in what they call the Old Testament, like third Maccabees, like some other books of that period. And so already we see that the Hebrew scripture, the Tanakh, is a more limited collection of books than what is included in many important Christian denominations, what they call the Old Testament. But it's not just, what books are in and what books are out. A key difference between the Tanakh and the Old Testament is we don't call it the Old Testament for a very good reason. The name Old Testament implies the existence of a New Testament. And testament, it's kind of an interesting word. I believe it's a translation of the word brit, or covenant, right? A covenant is about this relationship with this this agreed upon, mutually consented, ongoing relationship between God and humanity, or God and certain segments of humanity. I mean, God had covenants with Ishmael, and God had covenants with the Edomites, but God had his special covenant with us, and that's kind of our thing. And then Christianity is represented as a new covenant, just like we had our covenant renewed at various times, from a person to a family to a people. Christianity, again, I'm not an expert in Christianity, so there are people who can correct me on this. But the idea was that the advent of Christ as the Messiah represented a new covenant with humanity, a New Testament. And so everything prior to that point was then kind of sealed off as the Old Testament. That's the old way of doing things. This is the new way of doing things. And the read of the Old Testament, including the translations of various aspects of the Old Testament, the translations are not 100% verbatim. Even if you were to take the Hebrew Bible and translate it in English, and that's been done, and the Old Testament translated in English, also been done several times, there are subtle differences here and there, because it's translated with the point of view that this original covenant was setting up the new covenant. So there are certain aspects of the prophet Isaiah and Jeremiah and things like that that say that sort of presage the coming of Jesus as the Messiah, and so the translations are different. They'll use different words. There's even, I think it's in Psalm 2, that's like that ends with the phrase "Nishke ben," kiss the child, like a father kisses his child, and then I'll say the KJV, the King James version, will say "kiss the son." Ben means son, but they capitalize the S. So they're saying it's not about a father's relationship to his son or God's relationship to God's people, but it is about a human relationship to the capital S Son, to Jesus. And so we don't read that psalm that way. And so these are some differences. Like if you are translating the prior text with an eye toward presaging your belief, that is a different read. That is a retrojection. That is a different understanding of what this text means. And so I'm not going to be annoying about it, but I'll say if you think that the Old Testament, if you say, Christians worship the New Testament, Jews worship from the Old Testament, let's say we just call it the Testament, right? Because what is in the New Testament is not part of our vocabulary of faith, if you will. And so we have our book, and our book is not necessarily a prequel to your book. So it's like if there's a Christian person watching this, you believe what you believe. I will never challenge that for you personally. However, don't think that we think about our book the same way as you think about our book. So just wanted to throw that out there. I want to I'm reminded of a teaching of my teacher, Rabbi Bradley Shavidartson, who says, we tend to read our own texts lovingly and other people's texts critically. And so I read the Hebrew Bible lovingly, sometimes critically, sometimes pick fights with it, and it's a very Jewish thing to do. But I'm sort of predisposed toward reading it lovingly, as somebody for whom that is not their primary text would read it more critically, and that's human. That's okay. My goal today was to give you kind of a big overview. I think we taught the entire Hebrew Bible in about an hour flat, and also give some hints as to how this differs from our perspective than it might be in another people's perspective. So I'm just going to jump in here to the chat. Got a couple more comments. Forward Flower says, raised Catholic in the process of converting to Judaism, I can say that even though much of the book seems the same, the biggest difference is how they're interpreted by rabbis and priests. Yes, there's all sorts of interpretations. There's all sorts of translations. He says, forward, I don't know if it's he or she. Forward Flower says translation is another issue too. What we attempt to do is study Torah in the original Hebrew where possible, through different translations when for people, those of us who don't have the Hebrew. And in traditional settings, we teach the Torah in Hebrew as well. And so we try to stick to as close to, even though knowing that Hebrew might have been a distillation at a point in time of an oral tradition. There are certain segments of Daniel and other books in the Hebrew canon that were not written in Hebrew, they were written in Aramaic, which was another language about that part of the world at the same time that became kind of Aramaic became kind of the lingua franca, if you will, of the ancient Near East. And so, and a lot of our we have Targum Onkelos, which is a translation of an entire translation of the Torah into Aramaic. A lot of the Talmud is in Aramaic because that's what people spoke. And so there are drifts, right? There are subtle changes through translation as things are translated into Greek and then Latin and then German and into English and various English translations. And sometimes those translations have, I won't say a particular agenda, but a particular theology built into them. And so always be aware of that. If anybody wants to know my favorite translation of the Hebrew Bible, it is the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society Tanakh. They did a translation in 1985. That's the one I started learning from. I think it's I forget, maybe it's Milgram. There's some new translations coming out on the market. I don't know if the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, has added again. So if you're really keen on translations and things like that, keep abreast of that stuff. If you want to know what I learned from, because it is I'll say a contemporary translation that balances both contemporary understanding and scholarly work from across different denominations, that is most faithful to, it's sort of the most understandable and accurately reflected in English of the closest, nearest translation and kind of flavor of the original Hebrew. So if you find this on Amazon, I have a link to it on my website, rabbijohncarrier.com. I think I might have a resources page in there where you can find books that I like, and there's a link on Amazon to the JPS Tanakh, which has a side-by-side English and Hebrew. And even if you don't read Hebrew, I suggest getting this because it might inspire you to start learning some Hebrew. So I really appreciate everybody learning with me today. I got to run. I have a meeting with a cantor to plan for Shabbat services tonight. But thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. And listen to this. This may come out on the Jew Curious Show podcast sometime soon. If you're hearing this on the podcast, just know that I do a lot of stuff on YouTube Live that you can jump into and give me some props, give me some shout outs. I'll give you some shout outs and answer your questions live so that other people listening to the podcast can learn from your questions. So until next time, heroes, Shabbat Shalom and peace.